To Merrill College's panel on covering the 2020 political conventions. My name is Katie Auney. I'm the Assistant Dean for External Relations at Philip Merrill College. So I just wanted to take a moment to welcome everyone and just go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, we are recording this and it will be on our YouTube channel either later tonight or tomorrow. So if you do have to jump off early, rest assured you'll be able to watch the entire program. Everyone, as you're coming in, you should have your video off and your audio muted. And we just ask that you please keep yourself muted throughout the program so everybody can hear our panelists the best that they can. And if you have questions, we encourage you to post your questions in the chat box, and our moderator, Jim Carroll, will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll be getting to questions. If not during the program, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Jim Carroll, who's a member of our faculty at Merrill College, and he also directs our Capitol News Service Washington, D.C. Bureau, which normally would be getting ready to take a group of our students to both of the political conventions to cover them, but unfortunately due to the pandemic, they're unable to do so this year. And I think, Jim, you're breaking a long streak of covering the conventions in person, aren't you?
18, it was 18 and counting until this year. So what are you going to do?
With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
Thanks so much, Katie. I want to introduce our panelists, since you already know who I am. First, we have Tenikka Smith Hughes, Merrill class of '04. Tenikka is an Emmy-winning evening news anchor in Jacksonville, Florida at CBS 47 and Fox 30. She previously was an anchor reporter for WSOC-TV and WAXN-TV in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she covered the 2012 Democratic National Convention. Next, we have Megan Pratz, who's the Merrill class of 2010. Megan is political director of Cheddar, a live and on-demand video news network aimed at millennials. We all know who those are. Megan works on air and behind the scenes on Cheddar's Washington coverage, and she'll be covering the Democratic National Convention and will anchor Cheddar's coverage of the Republican National Convention from Washington. And Isrking, a former Merrill College adjunct lecturer. He is a Washington correspondent for USA Today. He currently covers politics and all things Washington, and is a veteran of political conventions, and I might add on a personal note, a former colleague and good buddy of mine. So glad to have all of you here. And as Katie mentioned, since we are on Zoom, ask audience to feel free to put questions on chat when use the chat function, and I'll try to spot those while I'm fielding questions or asking questions from the panel. We'll try to stay reasonably organized here. The humorist Will Rogers, when he was covering the 1924 Democratic Convention in New York, he told his readers that the only thing that can spoil this convention is for them to nominate someone. I joked as we were setting this panel up that Joe Biden would probably reveal his vice presidential pick just before we convened our little convention, and sure enough, so he has, with his historic pick of Kamala Harris. But far from spoiling our little convention here, I think the news will further enliven it. I'm sure it will. So having said that, and I even added a prop from my archives for the event tonight at the last minute. So we've had political conventions since 1831, when the Anti-Masonic Party convened just up the road in Baltimore. But with the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, of course, this year's two conventions are going to be nothing like anything we have ever seen. And as a matter of fact, Katie mentioned, of course, we were hoping to go to the conventions. There's not really any place to go except into virtual space. So to start this off, let's talk about tonight's development and how this may make the conventions more interesting. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are obviously going to be the stars of their own convention, but maybe it makes both conventions a little more newsworthy. So what do you think, Tenikka? You got a little more to write about and cover now?
think so. And I think based on what I'm seeing on social media, on my Facebook feed, I don't see the conventions going virtual as really being a hindrance, because I think that that's a tool that people are using to communicate. And we saw it for the last several years, but based on the traffic and the volume of what I'm seeing in just these last couple of hours, I think that that's going to add to that level of interest in seeing how they pull off the virtual debates, and people want to hear from the candidates. So I think that, yeah, it's going to be a lot for us to cover. Obviously here in Florida, I'm on the local level, so we're going to be looking at local ties, and everybody's watching the upcoming debate, of course, but I definitely think it adds interest, and I don't think there will be a lack of it.
What do you think, Ledge? Does it make these a little more newsworthy than otherwise to have Kamala Harris now? I mean, we knew he was going to pick somebody anyway, but does this add something additional to because of the historic nature of the pick?
It does, and let me just preface it by saying that, Jim, because nobody's at these conventions, your streak is still intact. But I do think, sure, of course. I mean, now we have another personality to talk about. Somebody who's already been on the national stage, somebody who's already been vetted, so not necessarily a surprise personality in that sense, but somebody that people are familiar with, and somebody who's going to, given her her personality, is going to not be a wallflower. And the knock on Biden is that he's been hiding in his basement and not getting out. Well, Kamala Harris is, I think, going to make sure that a voice on that ticket is heard, and heard loud, and heard often. So just that alone, I think, is going to be very big and very interesting to see. So, and the other thing I'd say is that she pressed Biden on the debate stage more than any other candidate. And it'll be interesting to see how the two of them, get along, get together. I'm sure that relationship has been patched. Obviously, he wouldn't be picking her if it wasn't. But she's an interesting personality, and I think it's going to make the next 3 months that much more, a roller coaster ride of excitement for reporters.
Yeah, Megan, what's your thoughts on that? And your audience, is this more reporting than maybe, or more interesting reporting you're going to have than maybe you thought you would have for the conventions?
So the most interesting thing to me about Kamala Harris is that it would have been surprising if she wasn't chosen, but she does add interest to the race, largely because any one that Joe Biden would have chosen would have been historic, and she is extra historic. She's not just a woman, she's a woman of color, the first ever to stand in that place on the ticket for a major party. So it's massive in that way. It's also done so far in the early preliminary polling that I've seen today. It has really added diversity to a party that was screaming for it, that was shouting loudly, especially among young voters, that is what they needed, that is what they were calling for, the same way we've seen similar calls in the streets in recent weeks and months in the Black Lives Matter protests. So this all adds to the weight of that moment. It gives this moment more weight. And I think that is what's most interesting. And as Tenikka was just saying, people are still excited about the conventions. Politicos across the country are going to watch one way or another. I think the real challenge for the parties is pulling it off without the kind of technical glitches we've seen, particularly from the Democratic side. Up to this point, the Trump team has a massive online operation. They're really good at this. They do it all the time. The Democrats have yet to prove that they're able to do it at that scale. And it's the kind of thing that with a much younger audience, with much younger viewers, with much younger voters, that's going to be, I think, their greatest challenge in a all virtual across America convention.
Well, one of the challenges, of course, as reporters is trying to plan to do these things. And Tenikka, you and I were talking earlier about the Republicans who were trying to find a place to have their convention, and what that meant for you and other reporters in Jacksonville. Can you briefly tell us a little bit about how hard it is or was to be planning for something that ended up going up in smoke anyway?
Yeah, it was extremely difficult. And just to give you some perspective, we saw the debate between the North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper and President Trump. And it was announced on June 11th that Jacksonville was going to get the celebration portion of the RNC, the event from August 25th through the 27th. And there was a 50-second video with our mayor touting, hey, we're a big, bold city. Who else could pull it off? We can, touting that Jacksonville's hosted a Super Bowl, and even the Rolling Stones and Paul McCartney. That was June 11th. By July 16th, the GOP announced it was going to be a scaled back convention here in Jacksonville. The arena where we believed it was going to be held about 15,000 people. Jacksonville during this time also enacted a mask ordinance. There were still questions about capacity, how much would be allowed, because the arena in Charlotte could hold 20,000. Ours could hold 15. So then July 20th, the sheriff of Jacksonville says, we cannot pull this off. I don't have the manpower, the resources. I have no contract signed. I have no plan. 3 days later, the president says, we are canceling the portion in Jacksonville. So we had about 30 days to go. So it was an absolute whirlwind. And to answer your question about planning, I know managers, they were meeting, doing what we could because we had no plan. And so we were trying to establish live shot locations, thinking about where reporters were able to set up, figuring out where we were going to be set up as anchors. We were organizing analysts to be a part of the potential coverage. And I just know from my experience covering the DNC in 2012, I know that they spent about 16 months then preparing for their convention. Tampa spent 28 months preparing for the RNC that same year. And so when I heard the announcement, my brain just went, what does this even look like? And so when you fast forward to the sheriff of Jacksonville saying, we have no plan, we have no signed contracts. And I was trying to offer some perspective to some of our younger reporters. We had, between Tampa and Charlotte, there were like 8,000 officers. They planned details like how to get officers water and batteries. There are multi-agency operations. It's a massive undertaking. And so for the plan to be revealed with 75 days to go, it was difficult for us to even plan as a news organization because we really didn't have information about it was very difficult.
And while newsrooms don't spend 28 months or even 12 months, perhaps, many newsrooms don't take that much time planning. There is an enormous amount of planning. For those who have never covered a convention, the normal procedures actually start to slowly, the wheels start turning actually in the end of the year before, where they start asking people about your needs, your space needs, your credentialing, how many people you may be sending, all that kind of stuff. So that the planning does actually start way early. And Megan, how many plans did you guys throw out before?
A dozen. We had the Charlotte plan, and we booked hotels in Charlotte along with the Milwaukee plan, where we booked hotels not in Milwaukee because there's not enough hotels in Milwaukee. And then we had the no more Charlotte, now we're going to Jacksonville plan. And then we had the Jacksonville scaled down, so we won't send as many people plan. I mean, it has been very interesting. And what's most interesting to me at this point is that today is the day that we finally get the list of speakers from the Democratic Convention. It starts on Monday. So today is the day that we finally have the list of the high profile speakers, not all speakers, but high profile speakers, and so that is fascinating simply because, the backdrop of all this is, of course, this pandemic that we're all living through, and what is taking so much of our time and resources to cover in all of our newsrooms Americans need right now. At the same time, there's an election, and one of our most important jobs is helping people make informed electoral decisions. And coronavirus is all part of that. And so, it's clear that they couldn't plan because there's a pandemic. And the situation in Jacksonville in particular changed within the time that they announced Jacksonville, even just a couple weeks later. It was a completely different coronavirus landscape separately from political. That has been the greatest challenge, I think, is trying to plan something that takes 2 years to plan. The Republicans have been in Charlotte for 2 years. The Democrats have been in Milwaukee nearly as long. It takes so long to plan these events. And until you go to them, you can't even fathom the scale of it. You can look on TV and see the photos, and it's massive. It's a massive, almost like concert feel. But everything that goes on behind the scenes, there's a massive security perimeter. You get a wedding cake tiering of credentialing. And so you can have people, and you can have 100 people credentialed in your organization, and some get into the building, but some can't even get in the security perimeter, and it's tiered from there. And so all of that requires planning and logistics. And I will say at Cheddar, our original plan was to send about 20 people. It was going to be our largest scale plan to date. And as coronavirus kind of ticked forward starting in March, it became clear that that was not going to be what we were going to do. And so at this point, we, as you know, are not going to the convention. We will still cover it, but we're going to center our coverage in DC and in New York, where our largest bureaus are, because that's the safest option for our team, rather than kind of figure out where in the country we should be.
USA Today, they're planning to, are you planning to have anybody in Milwaukee, or I'm not sure where the other place is. Is it going to be
Gettysburg,
or Gettysburg, or Charlotte, or some Charlotte,
or
and some Gettysburg, or the White House? Well, you have people there already, so you're good.
So for the people who don't know, USA Today is part of the Gannett network, which is 260 newspapers around the country. We were very well primed to cover both conventions. We have the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, which is 2 blocks away from the arena that the convention was going to happen in. And we have the Jacksonville newspaper, which was obviously right in the second convention city. So we were pretty well primed to.
The Florida Times Union.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Sorry, it escaped me. It's a new paper.
That's all right.
So, and we were going to have about, I would say, I was involved in the planning, but I would say probably, certainly dozens, maybe 100 journalists, obviously because the newspapers themselves were there, but we would, send people, 20, 25, 30, maybe 35 people. We'd have people from other big newspapers in our chain, Louisville, Indianapolis, perhaps, et cetera. And all of a sudden, we went from going, 100 plus, let's say, journalists gathering together, covering the convention, every single, speech, every single meeting, et cetera, to now being scattered, wherever we are in our homes, in our basements. And we're going to be coordinating it that way. There will be people at the White House, but it is so, catch as catch can. We've never seen anything. Nobody has ever seen anything like this. And we're just rolling with the punches as best as we can, but we will be covering it.
One of the advantages, those of us who have been at conventions know, to being on the ground there is you can sometimes get a little bit behind the curtain. You can talk to people in the hallways under the risers. You bump into people at breakfast and lunch and, at 2 o'clock in the morning dinner. Is that going to be a much bigger challenge to have that sort of serendipitous coverage that we've always, found helpful at a convention? Is that all gone away basically because it's all gone virtual? And, what does that do to what the public sees and does not see, and what the public understands and does not understand about what goes on at the convention this year?
Well,
2 conventions.
I'll jump in if you guys don't mind. So I was at the 2016 convention in Cleveland. The Republican won. And as you may remember, there was a guy named Jeb Bush who ran for president that year and was trounced. And he was a favorite. I was covering the Florida convention, Florida delegation at the time. And he was such a favorite son of Florida for many years. And how quickly they turned on him because he didn't embrace Donald Trump right away, who by that time obviously was the presumptive nominee. And being in the room talking to these people, these former Jeb Bush acolytes in a way, and all of a sudden to see them say that they were disappointed that he hadn't gotten behind Trump, showed how much his star had fallen and how much Florida's Republican Party had shifted, like many Republican parties around the state. And I think being there, talking to people privately and publicly made all the difference. Yes, it's going to be less insightful to be there, talking to the donors, talking to the party officials, talking to the delegates who really look forward to this. I mean, I feel bad for all the delegates. They've waited all this time to get here, and now nothing. So yes.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. What do you think, Tenikka, about the not having the behind the scenes stuff that we always get a chance to sort of fill in and really explain things to people better?
No, I absolutely agree with what he said. I think too, speaking of a delegate, the Democrats announced their plan to go virtual previously, and I was speaking to a Florida senator, and she was disappointed, but she completely understood for safety reasons, obviously being in Florida. And I think even I remember covering the DNC in 2012, and there were celebrity sightings. There was just this level of exposure that people got, like you said, to look behind the curtain. And I think it will be interesting to see how both parties create a level of engagement and a level of connection for people. Obviously, I think once people have their minds made up, they have their minds made up about who they're going to support. But it'll be interesting to see how they translate that into a virtual space, because I know, like you said, delegates are disappointed that they're missing out on that opportunity. And I think it affects storytelling because they're going to be doing a lot of Zooms and relying on a lot of sources to try to get information about what's happening, obviously. And we're still learning about press limitations while covering some portions of some conventions. And so I definitely think that it's going to create some challenges.
What do you think, Megan?
I echo what the other two panelists have said. I think that this is probably the most challenging part of it, because a thing that is kind of missed in all of this is that it's not just the physical convention presence. You can go to the convention like I did in Tampa in 2012, and you can never go inside the building and still get a ton of access. There are events, there are brunches and lunches and dinners and after parties every single day. And there are senators, there are US senators, there are children and family members of the nominee. They show up and they show out because they want it to be a big party. They want it to be a big celebration. And you really do miss that experience. And that is both professionally and personally rewarding when you get to talk to someone from a network that you never thought that you'd get to talk to. It's a huge loss for local news reporters in particular in these host cities who want to be able to, to have this national moment, and it's going to be a scaled back moment. I think that, there's not a whole lot we can do about it. Like Tenikka said, you got to work sources and hope that you can get some inside information. We have an amazing booking department at Cheddar, and our politics booker has been working around the clock to get people excited to come on about the convention. And some people are, but people who don't want to come on with us in a regular time, we can't grab them in a hallway and ask them a couple questions. There's no gaggle opportunity. I remember in 2012 getting Jan Brewer right after the famous kind of wagging her finger at President Obama moment, talking about immigration. And, that was such a only because we were there in that physical space moment. And those types of things are going to be lost. What I do think you'll see is something you've seen throughout the pandemic up to this point, which is that everyone really wants to talk to you. They're really excited. They have a lot to say, and no one is grabbing them in hallways. So there are people who otherwise might not be super interested in an interview who are willing to come on because it's a time that they would otherwise make themselves available. That I think is the advantage, but it is definitely a loss, and we all kind of have to figure out a way around it. And I don't see a great way around it, unfortunately.
Yeah, you anticipated a question we just had from one of our audience members here. It was asking, how do you try to get at the local delegations and talk to the state leaders? And I mean, obviously we all have the Rolodexes and we can call them, but there's no substitute again for that being, in the backstage somewhere where you can talk to them, sometimes quietly, where they don't really want a camera. No offense to our TV friends, but this is what TV reporters do too, right? I mean, sometimes you talk to people without the camera there and you hear things that once you say, well, let me just put you on camera, and then they're a little more guarded, a little more nuanced. They don't want to quite say.
Well, it looks like Jim froze there a second. Tenikka and Legend, Megan, are you guys still there?
Yes.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So I think if you guys sort of got the gist of where Jim was going with that question, if any of you want to jump in on that. And it looks like we've got Jim back now. Tenikka, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, yeah, and that speaks to what Megan was saying about on a local level, we have delegates and great sources that we've worked from doing stories here on the local level who physically won't even be in these spaces. They're going to be casting their votes from their couch. And so having access to certain information, it depends on who's there. And at this point, we know a lot of people who don't plan to be there for safety reasons. And also I was going to say from a reporting standpoint, when we thought it was going to be in Jacksonville, a part of those conversations was who would be allowed in buildings, if we were going to even send reporters into certain hotels, into where the speeches were planned for safety reasons. So that was a whole different barrier that was going to impact our potential access to people, to information. And so that was a whole different dynamic that we were having to try to consider in COVID. How do we cover this and do it safely? And different people have different comfort levels on a personal level. We're all journalists, but still people have pre-existing conditions and different factors that played a role in some of that decision making of how are we going to get access to this information when we're dealing with the pandemic. And now that we're seeing more and more, it's going to be scaled back and limited. Obviously, Jacksonville's off the table now, but I'll be interested in seeing how you guys plan to navigate that, Megan and Ledge, and do it safely.
Yeah, you know, the challenge that for us, same health and safety reality, when we were planning to send a whole bunch of people, even at the beginning of this pandemic, people are going to have to fly on airplanes to cities and be in cities and stay in hotels, all things that we know are high risk activities, be indoors. That's another thing that we know is a high risk activity. And it definitely added a layer of complexity that did lead to us scaling back, certainly more than we'd planned to. I think, you know, the greatest challenge to covering the conventions this year is that they aren't going to be anything like we've ever seen before. And as even the planning process of this has gone, it has shown for the kind of first time how much we relied on that old style of doing things to get these stories, to get the inside scoop about how the Ohio delegation was going to change its vote to vote for Bernie Sanders because they were protesting something, or, you know, like those are the kinds of things that we're not going to see. And I think that it's going to be a little bit less compelling, but it also won't be on cable news for, you know, 23 hours. So there's always a trade-off, I think. But one of the things that I think when we were talking about delegates is that there are other opportunities to tell other stories. And I think that's where we as journalists get creative, right? So we think about how delegates are sitting on their couches. So we see if there's one who will let us have a photographer, watch them cast their vote, someone who's able to do that. That's what we do. And I'm sure that Tenikka is doing things just like that. It's the creativity part is definitely stretching us, but we're trying to find those types of opportunities and keep it interesting for people because it is so very different. And frankly, the novelty of how different it is does help in some of the coverage because it is so unlike anything we've ever seen before. Frankly, we're all just figuring it out together, and so are our viewers or our readers.
I want to jump in with a question, and I don't know if it's okay, but a question popped up in the chat.
Absolutely.
While we're working on getting Jim back. Oh, okay. The question was, Tenikka, what can you tell us about Florida this year? Over the last 20 years, especially in 2000, Florida, the person spelled it D-U-H, she said, I'm a native, I can say that, has been incredibly close. What about this year? Hard to say. I mean, obviously, the polling is changing. I know a few weeks ago they had Biden leading by double digits, but we also have a Republican governor who has very close ties to President Trump. We have, I know here in Duval County in Jacksonville, we have a Republican mayor. So it will be interesting. It's hard to say. I know right now there are a lot of questions about the voting process with the pandemic. Aside from questions about the validity of mail-in ballots or different things that are swirling out there as well. I just got my vote by mail information in the mail this week, and it's warning people already to be prepared for a large number of voters in November. So how will Florida go? It's kind of hard to say, but I didn't know if you guys want to jump in on that conversation. There are a lot of questions right now about the safety. We have polling sites that are testing centers for COVID, where you go in one door to vote in our primary right now, and you go in a separate door to go get tested for COVID. So a lot of people just have questions, I think, about this voting process.
You think perhaps there's going to be a lot more reporting outside the conventions themselves in some ways, just because of so many other things going on?
Yes, yes. Especially, I think people want to know that their vote is going to count. People are concerned about how they can do it safely. I know in Florida, we traditionally, and even in Georgia as of late, we've had long lines that have gone into the night. So I am not sure what to expect with the pandemic going on. But as she said, I mean, that's going to be one of the major stories that we're going to be shifting gears and telling, especially this primary is kind of a trial run, like I said, with 2 of our sites being COVID sites. But I'm interested to see how this all shakes out, but I know a lot of our storytelling is going to start shifting in that direction as people now get their eyes on the election, especially now that Joe Biden's running mate has been announced, and we're going to get through these conventions, and that's the next thing we're going to be focusing on heavily.
Here's a radical thought. Some commentators say that conventions are just productions aimed at mainly at a home television audience anyway, so this virtual convention format that both parties are going to use is really a logical evolution, and it's no big deal. What do you say to that as far as, again, looking at it from the standpoint of reporters? Are we going to just see a lot of reporting that's going to be a rehash of what we just watched on television, or do you think a lot of it's going to be ignored entirely?
Well, let me jump in on this one. I'd say that the sad footnote of all this is that it is going to give the parties more control of the message, and there won't be reporters at their heels, challenging them on certain things as the convention unfolds. Talking to delegates who may not agree with the overall message, or all these sort of splinter stories that are so valuable in shaping and reporting sort of how the shape of the convention comes out. So I do think it is going to be more production oriented and more sort of driven by the party's message. I would like to sort of just to pick up on what Tenikka said about a dry run. So much of the pandemic has made us question how elections are going to be conducted. Well, it's also obviously making us question how presidents are going to be, or candidates are going to be nominated. So much of this is now, it's never been done before. Can they really do this? How will it come out? And it sounds like process stories, and they are to some extent, but I think, done correctly, they really sort of speak to the election that's just around the corner, and people's faith in systems. And so that will be interesting to see how it unfolds.
You think we'll ever go back to what assuming 4 years from now, we finally have this pandemic under control, please, 4 years.
Yeah.
But do you think the parties will be tempted to just go back to the way they did it, or do you think the instinct is going to be to see how much of this can be adapted for new platforms, and maybe the convention itself will be 2 days? Although again, the cities that get these, they want to make the hotel money and the restaurant money and all the rest of it.
Just to sort of pick up, I'd say no. I think they will generally go back because, these are such parties for the conventioneers themselves too. These are the people that, for many of them, have toiled in the vineyard, and this is their reward to come out to the convention and cheer their person, and they'll have 4 days of TV coverage. And so I would be surprised if it fundamentally changed that.
Tenikka, have you seen any projections on what viewership is likely to be? And Megan, maybe have you seen anything, given that this is going to be virtual? There's not going to be, unless they're going to do something like they did in sports and generate fake crowds with fake cheering or something. I don't know. Cardboard cutouts. We're not in that level of detail. But do you think have you seen any projections on what viewership is likely to be, or do you think this kind of virtual convention is going to be competing with, cartoons and, streaming on Netflix, and a lot of people are just going to tune out? Have you seen any projections on that, Megan or Tenikka?
Megan probably would be best to take this question, but I think that it's going to be a mix. Some people are just burned out from between work. There's no, like, for my husband's working from home right now, and he hates it because he likes that separation. I think to an extent, some people are going to be burned out. It feels like this election cycle, it feels like it's gone on forever and ever and ever. And so I don't know about projections per se, but I think even on a local level, we're going to have to really get creative to figure out how do we push people to our digital platforms and get them to watch, because we rely a lot on network affiliates. So it's like, how do we pull in a piece of that pie too, in terms of the stories that we're telling on a local level and leading up to the election? So Megan, I don't know if you want to jump in too.
Yeah, no, so we are, all of our broadcast partners, and Cheddar is unique in that it is on pretty much every streaming television service. So if you can watch live TV streaming, Cheddar's there. All of our broadcast partners are planning for large audiences. I think a thing that for those of us who live in this world can miss is that people haven't really had anything because of this pandemic. We would have previously had, first of all, we would have had a convention in July. We didn't have a convention in July. So they really have not had a must-watch TV moment that wasn't maybe a presidential coronavirus briefing, but those have also become so rote and routine at this point that people kind of tune it out. This is new. It's different. It's exciting. So for people who are into politics, I think they'll tune in. I also think the virtual convention lends itself really well to passive watching, which means that you can turn it on in the background and go about your night, scroll through your phone, see what people are saying. It doesn't require the type of attention and paying attention that you need to have. I also think in general, separate from the Democratic convention, the Republicans are nominating Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is often must-watch TV. And his convention nominating speech is no different from that. Not just because he's president, but because of the type of rhetoric he delivers routinely. It is very much, what are we going to get? What are we going to see? What is this going to be like? And I think that lends itself to people wanting to tune in. They haven't had a Dateline moment. This is a Dateline moment, a dated item that they know they can tune in and watch AOC speak on stage at the Democratic National Convention, and the Democrats are giving her that platform. That's a huge moment. And so like Bernie Sanders, same thing, huge moment. And that means that people in those camps are going to tune in for their people, and they'll keep watching. People are still stuck at home. They haven't been able to go anywhere. They don't really have a lot of other stuff going on. So there is definite burnout. But for people who are excited about politics, I don't think you're going to see them tune out. Plus, if they watch the news passively anyway, it's going to be on. And that kind of means that I just don't see them changing the channel if that's their typical viewing pattern. So we are not planning for there to be fewer viewers. We're in fact planning for there to be more regular viewers in prime time. And largely for a lot of the reasons that I've named here, because it's the election and people are interested. In any other year, they would be interested. This year, they're stuck at home and interested. So that helps.
It's very much so. Go ahead, Ledge.
I was going to say, and has there been more of a contrast than Donald Trump, who's on your TV screen every day, and Joe Biden, how eloquent or ineloquent will he be? I think people are almost just as curious as to what is going to come out of his mouth as Donald Trump's.
And Ledger kind of alluding to that with my next question, which is, are there one or two things that you're going to be most looking for in terms of stories that come out of each of the conventions?
That's a good question. I mean, I think what I alluded to earlier, which was the relationship between Kamala and Joe Biden, given a little bit of the history early on, how do they come off together? Is the chemistry evident? I think they're supposed to appear together Wednesday, a week from Wednesday together. I'll definitely be looking at that aspect, probably more than others. I mean, how this will be also the return of people that we, haven't seen for a while. Bernie Sanders, Michelle Obama, Barack Obama. And I mean, John Kasich is going to be speaking for Biden's nomination Monday night. Very interested to hear what he has to say. So yeah, I think we just saw the list, and there are plenty of stories within each one, but those are just a few that I'm looking at right now.
Tenikka, how about you? What are you looking for out of this?
Well, based on some of the stuff I'm already seeing, even on my personal social media pages, I think Megan touched on this about Kamala being this historic candidate in so many ways, a graduate of an HBCU. A lot of people are talking about that, her racial background, people are talking about that. So I think I'm going to be interested to see how or if she is able to galvanize communities of color and or women, and seeing how they're going to be responding leading up to Election Day. Will the historic nature of who she is, just the essence of who she is, will that in itself attract voters? What will her messaging be to the reaching out to those various groups? I'll be interested to see how that plays out.
And I guess you'll go out into the community where you are and try to get some of those answers from the voters.
Yes.
Megan, what are you going to be looking for out of these conventions story-wise? What do you see as one or two things you're looking for?
I think it's going to be interesting to see. I'll do one for each convention. So the thing I'm most interested to see in the Democratic convention is how they put messaging about members of their party who are outside of what we'd say towing the line. I mentioned earlier Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, other members of the so-called squad, Bernie Sanders being there. You know, Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. He's not registered as a Democrat. He doesn't pay into that party apparatus, which is something that has been controversial in the past. And yet they are giving him a prime speaking spot because his voice is so important in this increasingly diverse, and I don't just mean racially, but this increasingly diverse perspectives of Democrats and registered Democrats, and particularly younger voters. Democratic voters are more diverse in 2020 than they will have ever been. They're also younger than they've ever been. And that is so vitally important to the way the convention is created. AOC is the youngest woman ever elected to the US Congress, and giving her a starring role on Tuesday the night that is historically held for those up and coming stars of the party, I think is really important. So those are some of the things I'll be watching. I also will echo Tenikka in saying that suburban women are perhaps the most important voting bloc in 2020. They often are, but they are particularly because they've moved so far away from President Trump after voting for him in 2016. And will they be energized by a female vice presidential candidate or not is very interesting to watch. In the Republican convention, I'm most interested in their messaging, because the fact of the matter is Republicans are flagging in a way they did not think they would be. And if there was no pandemic, I don't know that they would be flagging in this way, that they would be falling in the polls, that the president would be facing, incredibly low approval ratings. So I'm interested to see most how they turn that message around. I remember last summer in Florida during one of the Democratic primary debates, they talked a lot about socialism, and that's been kind of a key message for the Republican Party since that point is socialism. We're opposed to socialism over in the country, and whether that's a message that they continue or if they take a different message. But I think the Republican Party has not solidified around a single message up to this point because they didn't expect to be in this spot. And it'll be interesting to see if they're able to solidify around a message, in advance of the president speaking in Gettysburg or wherever he speaks.
We have a good question here from an audience member who said that with Harris being a historic pick, partly because of her racial background and newsrooms at the same time having conversations about diversity, how important is it, especially now, to ensure that more journalists of color cover these conventions and the election in general? Who wants to take that?
Well, I'll start. Extremely important. I mean, I know that Gannett and USA Today, we've had like many newsrooms around the country, having a real conversation about how best to cover, the Black Lives Matter movement, how best to represent and exemplify, the face of America, the changing face of America. Are we doing enough in that realm? And I know there's been a lot more emphasis lately to do just that. So, and I think the convention plays a part in that whole tapestry of how, we see ourselves and how we see America. So I know that we'll have, I think, a pretty sizable number of journalists of color and female as well as male. So couldn't tell you exact numbers, but I think it's something that we are very attuned to.
Anybody else want to?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's especially important, and not just because Kamala Harris is in the race. I think this is a conversation that newsrooms should be having, need to be having. I was recently a part of a corporate task force for Cox Media Group to really look at how we're handling diversity, equity, and inclusion, including in our content. And even in the last week, I believe the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, they put out a message basically saying that they wanted newsrooms to stop labeling people of color as minorities. Instead, depending on what you're referring to, if you're talking about statistics and data, using emerging majority or underprivileged. So even thinking about our language around how we're speaking about these communities, because obviously communities of color will be watched and talked about to see how we are voting and see how we're trending. And I think that it is important whether you have people of color in your newsroom or not. Now, of course, I do believe that we should have more diverse voices as a part of that editorial process. I think that's extremely important to be reflected in the coverage and in the gathering. But I think in those newsrooms that are limited, it's important to have those conversations. no matter what convention, no matter what candidate, especially when you're really looking at these voters, because obviously we know our voters aren't a monolith, and I think it's important to have those intelligent conversations about how do we describe them, what kind of issues do they care about, and just to make sure that the representation is there.
I believe Jim is frozen again, but I actually want to answer this as well. And I'll answer more from a personal note than what I'm doing at Cheddar, because one of the things as we reckon with a very difficult racial history in this country that we all kind of have to confront is how that's impacted us in positive and negative ways. And obviously as a white woman, I've been impacted in many positive ways, which is unfair. And so, that's a thing that I struggle with. And so I use my platform as a white woman to elevate voices of people who don't have that same platform. That is what I have committed to do. And that is what I continue to push Cheddar to do, and what we do, with mixed success, because that's the fact, is we're all reckoning with this at the same time. One of the things that I'm really proud of that we have done at Cheddar is we've recently launched a new series called American Voter. And in that series, we bring in different diverse voices to give their experience as someone who's going to head to the ballot box in 2020 and make a really difficult choice, especially for people who are doing it for the first time. So, I wanted to launch that series with our production staff because I want to make sure that we are bringing many different voices to the table, and that includes everyone. And like I said, we are not unique. As Led said, USH Day is going through the same thing. Gannett is going through the same thing. I think every media group is going through the same thing. In short answer to the question, it is incredibly important that we have diverse voices, because particularly in politics, our coverage is so very, has been for a long time, so very one way. And diversity in a newsroom helps us expand that in every way, but especially in the political sphere, which, even just the makeup of our lawmakers has become so much more diverse in the last 2 years. So, that's a thing that we as journalists want to reflect America too, just like we want our lawmakers to reflect America, just like we want the voices that we elevate to reflect America. And I think we all, need to make a commitment to do that. And that's something that I do try to do. Like I said, I don't always succeed, but I do certainly try.
It's striking when you see political coverage of not too many years ago, and pictures of reporters, gatherings at the White House, political conventions, just a couple of decades ago, where almost everybody in the picture is male and white. And so that has been changing, not fast enough, but it has. You don't see that in the same way anymore when you're watching people covering political events and coverage of a lot of events now. But it's striking how not very long ago it was so male dominated and white male dominated as to be. I mean, it strikes you now as like, what's wrong with this picture? That's how much things are changing, but they haven't changed far enough, obviously.
And to ignore, Jim, if I could piggyback on that, to ignore the changing demographic of the political conversation is to ignore the news. And as reporters, you just can't do that. You shouldn't do it, and you can't do that. And so there's an evolution. It's taken longer than it should, but I don't know of many reporters who aren't keenly, at least, aware of what's happening and interested in covering what's happening.
Well, that's part of being a journalist, right? Is that we tend to know more about what's happening because we spend so much time in it. So the best example with politics is that I have family members who will often ask me, like, who should I vote for in this election? I'm like, I can't tell you, but I can give you some insight into different positions. We spend all our time knowing things. We're kind of know-it-alls. And so, that's a challenging thing for some people, but it makes us really good at trivia. But I think that's the real takeaway, is that we know a lot, and we want to know a lot because our biggest and most important job is letting you know more, is letting the public know more. And if we don't know the right information, if we don't know these things, if we aren't, in touch with what's happening in society, how can we do that very vital and important job?
We have a good question here from another audience member. And how are each of you in your newsrooms ensuring that your coverage of the conventions and ultimately the election programs to the public interest? One of the biggest mistakes, this writer says, one of the biggest mistakes, pitfalls made in 2016 from so many outlets has been the politics as sports coverage, and especially the wall-to-wall coverage of Trump's speeches without context, regardless of news value and lack thereof. How do we avoid those pitfalls this time around? Anybody want to take that one?
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. This is kind of an internal conversation we have every day, every hour. You know, do we write about his tweets? Do we not write about his tweets? You know, if a tweet is, shall we say, not 100% factually correct, do we ignore it, or do we write it and try to put context in it? And I mean, the conventions are sort of you know, an opportunity / minefield for the same kind of you know, behavior, et cetera. And you know, I don't know what the answer is. We talk about this a lot. We try not to cover it as a sport, but there are aspects of it that can't be avoided. People are elected. You know, states pick the presidents, and you know, votes are cast, and I mean, there is a sort of a sporty quality about it. We try to put as much context as possible, and believe me, if readers don't think we are, they let us know. So it's a continual battle, especially with this president.
I think on the local level, obviously, in every newsroom, stories are about people. And I think for us, it's about pulling out the issues. A lot of people care about unemployment right now. You know, Florida's unemployment system, getting people back online, it was just disastrous. And we've had a reporter dedicated to that. That's going to continue. People care about COVID and safety. People care about their children in school. People care about a lot of issues right now. And so I think on a local level, we're not wall to wall only on election night, and then we're going back and forth between local coverage and national coverage. So I think that for us, it's about how do we keep the focus on the issues that are important to our viewers, and really boiling it down and making sure we're hearing from those diverse viewers. I think that's how we build public interest for us. What issues are impacting our community? What issues speak to people in Florida and Georgia? We do cover parts of Georgia. So I think that that's key. These campaigns, it boils down to the impact on real people, and it's about telling those stories.
Megan, do you have a?
So you know, it's interesting.
I mean, one of the things people talk about is we look at polls. Like every day there's a poll, which is sort of that sports aspect of this thing.
Yeah.
You know, and of course people think what was the point of that in 2016? Because all the polls showed one thing, and then on election night, you know, the chances that Clinton was going to be president went from 75% to 20% in about 2 hours. So, you know, it was like, well, we spent months and months looking at all that stuff, and it was pointless rather than talking maybe more about certain issues. So, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but that sports element.
No, I think that has been, you know, it has sown distrust in journalism, which is really unfortunate. Largely because one of the challenges with polling is that it's numbers, and you say the numbers, and if the numbers aren't wrong, it's wrong. And many of those polls were very close to accurate within the margin of error. They just called the wrong person. And, you know, but people don't, that's not what is told to them. They're not explained how a poll works. And frankly, I don't think people have time. They don't have time to sit and listen to me explain what a margin of error is and why a sample size of 1,500 is representative of the whole country. That's not, you know, people have things to do. I think something Tenikka touched on that I think is really important is that in a way, this pandemic has been an opportunity for us to talk to people about more than just politics leading up to an election, because politics is kind of the last thing on their mind right now. It is, how am I going to get my kids to school? What is school going to look like? How am I going to stay safe and healthy? Am I going to be called back to work? All of those are things that, you know, at a local level people are feeling, but at a national level they're feeling too. At Cheddar, we have a large business news presence, and so we do a lot of that. That means that politics can never be wall to wall, because business and politics, while they mix, they don't really mix. And so that gives us an opportunity as well. We will do big, you know, splashy convention coverage. We'll do big splashy debate coverage, big splashy election night coverage, but then people will tune in the next morning and they'll get the recap, and then you'll hear about the market, and you'll hear about consumer pocketbook issues, and you'll hear about entertainment headlines, and you'll get all of your news in one place. I think what this has done this time that we're living through that has given us, you know, no convention, is it has also allowed us to refocus our priorities on how we cover things. And even political coverage has become so much more focused on the voter, on the person, rather than the event. And I think that's the, you know, when we talk about covering conventions, that's what this has come down to is, yeah, we'll cover the conventions. And there are a lot of really interesting storylines there. But at the end of the day, we're talking to the voter, and that may have gotten lost in 2016. I think we're a lot more focused on it this year in particular.
That leads nicely into what I was going to ask each of you in the short time we have left is for reporters who are trying to cover the conventions and stories around the conventions, what's a pro tip you could share for first timers? We had a question earlier and it's kind of a loaded one. So I kind of went past it because we had a couple other issues we wanted to cover, but somebody said, well, how would a convention normally operate? Which is, you know, a whole seminar in itself. But for those who've never covered a convention or maybe only covered one or two, what's a pro tip or two that each of you could share with our audience tonight?
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think it you know, as Tenikka and Megan talked about, these are stories about people. I mean, this is a political process story that, you know, the outcome's already known. But I think trying to get a hold of delegates, you know, the parties put out lists, and these people, this is their moment, and there are always interesting stories about why this person became a delegate, how they fit into the party's messaging. You know, is it something that they've aspired to for a long time? How did they get here? I mean, you know, that's sort of a people approach to it. There are also sort of more, you know, you look at who's paying, well, there's no convention, so I guess nobody's paying for parties now, but
the money's still flowing.
the money's still flowing. Follow the money, absolutely.
Yeah.
That would be another sort of simple way to do it. I mean, you know, look who's giving money and how much and what are they trying to get in return.
Tenikka?
I think, again, keeping it about people. The issue is the umbrella, and you just got to keep diving down deep. And then, to Megan's point, it's our job to add that perspective, not bog them down, but to just add that context, add that perspective to the conversation. But that's the biggest thing. Keep it about people and really taking, sometimes in our newsrooms, we talk about like just taking that step back. Sometimes when you're in it as a journalist, you're looking at it through your deadlines and your lens. Take a step back and look at it as if you were a viewer, and make sure that you're really, as a journalist, adding that proper perspective, but really keeping the story about people and how they're impacted and really the issues that are important to them.
I'm going to take it back to when I was a student at Merrill College of Journalism, because in my first ever broadcast writing class, we all wrote basically like a print story as a script because none of us knew how to write for broadcast. And the best advice I ever got was like, write it like you're telling your mom. So how would you tell your mom this story? And I think that is how you need to do the conventions, is how would you tell your mom? How would you tell your mom what's happening at the convention? Because we do get very mired in the details. In terms of the best way to cover it, it's going to be different. It's going to be unlike anything any of us have done. And so that's the hard thing about giving advice, because I don't know how to cover it. I'm figuring it out with you guys. But Ledge had a great point. Reach out to delegates. They love to talk. One of my producers somehow got on an Ohio delegate list, and this man will email him for, you know, these long tomes about being a delegate. He loves it. He loves to be involved. And so, you know, delegates, they're not all state reps and, you know, and members of Congress and senators. They're a lot of times regular people and business owners, and they want to tell you their story about why they got involved in politics and why they really love Donald Trump or why they really don't love Donald Trump, because that's kind of the two storylines we got this year. There are plenty of people willing to talk. Another thing that I found really helpful during this pandemic in particular is people are at home and a lot more willing to talk to you via any of the numerous devices that they have around them at a time. So, you know, feel free to, if you find someone on Twitter who's writing about being unemployed and they're upset because they haven't gotten their check, reach out to them. They might talk to you. and then you have an interview for a story, that's whole story. So never be afraid to use your, especially if this is your first time, I assume you're a digital native type person, never be afraid to use those skills to find sources, because a source doesn't have to be someone, you know, inside a company or inside an office of a lawmaker. A source can be, you know, my neighbor next door who lost his job as a plumber and can't get a new job because there are no jobs. Like, that's a source. So don't be afraid to reach out to those and have fun, because it's supposed to be fun and it's different. And, you know, frankly, it's kind of like we're all throwing something at the wall to see what sticks. So don't worry about it too much, because none of us really know what we're doing this time.
Yeah. Give yourself grace. And I think viewers are much more accommodating with everything going on. You never thought you'd see your nightly anchor reporting from their living room, but you are. And I think give yourself grace, because I think viewers have a level of understanding that we are all navigating this and figuring it out.
So I got this question. I know we're running right up to we're actually 1 minute over already, but I'll see if I can throw it out, and if you can answer it in maybe 35 or 40 seconds quickly, each of you. The question was, you know, that if a convention isn't contested, it's really mostly just a party PR stunt. Is that more or less true now that it's virtual, or are they still worth covering for some reason?
I think, go ahead, Ledge.
I was going to say, yeah, you know, especially if you're a political junkie like me, I think one thing to look for is enthusiasm or lack of enthusiasm. How enthusiastic are these people who are gathering together virtually behind the nominee? I mean, these are the most enthusiastic people in the party. And if you detect that they're not, you know, 100% behind this person, or have doubts, or are frustrated or whatever, you can get a sense of, remember, of the election that's coming up. This is, you know, look for signs of how this is going to affect November.
It is definitely more of a PR stunt, if you will, PR opportunity for the parties this year. That does not, however, mean it's not worth covering. We get press releases all the time that are worth covering. I think that the thing that makes this worth covering is, again, getting back to the informed public. They want to know what these people have to say, and we have the opportunity to fact check them. And that goes for both sides. You know, both sides like to spin. We have the moment to say, so-and-so said this, it is not true, this is the fact. And that is what we're here for, is to give people that information.
Yeah, I agree. And I think earlier it came up about how, because of the virtual formatting, they have a lot more control over messaging. We're going to get live tele-rallies and pre-recorded messages. And so I think that, as she just said, it's our opportunity to take that information, process it, add that perspective, fact check. So I think it is worth covering. It will be different. And I think it's just forces journalists to continue to be diligent in getting the answers and making sure that we're presenting it in a way that's easy to understand, and where people won't feel bogged down and they can still feel engaged, especially leading up to the election. So I definitely think it's important as well.
Well, unfortunately, this is not a television network where I don't have an anchor breathing down my neck because I'm taking their time, but I am taking everybody else's time and our kind audience's time, as we've run about 3 minutes over. So this has been a very thoughtful and fascinating discussion. I want to thank all our three panelists: Tenikka Smith Hughes from Jacksonville CBS 47 and Fox 30, Megan Pratz from Cheddar, and Isrking from USA Today. And much thanks to Katie Auney, Merrill's Assistant Dean for External Relations, and Olivia Suttles, Merrill's Development Coordinator, for helping putting this together. And once again, I'm Jim Carroll, and I wish you a pleasant evening and enjoy the conventions.
Thank you, Jim. I just wanted to make a plug for some upcoming virtual programming that we'll have starting in September. This is actually sort of kicking off a series of election-related virtual events that we'll be doing. The Merrill College will be partnering with several other colleges within the University of Maryland for some programming in September. We have a program on September 17th that will focus on disinformation and fact-checking as it pertains to the election. We'll have another program in early October that will talk about polling. It will, for those who have the time, we'll talk about what goes into a poll and how you should read a poll and what the margin of error is, and how the media should talk about polls. And then we'll also have a couple other programs specifically with Merrill College in September. One about covering protests with a number of our alumni who have been covering protests both this summer and before that. and another panel talking about diversity in the newsroom. So a lot of things I think that touch on some of the topics that came up this evening. So keep an eye out in your email for more information on those panels, and I hope you'll be able to join us. Thanks again to all of our panelists, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.